The purpose of this webinar is to launch the report itself, which formally launched on Wednesday, so you may have already had a chance to have a quick look at it by now. We'll also be hearing perspectives from our two very thoughtful speakers, who I'll introduce in a second. This is also an opportunity for you to provide comments and feedback and ask us your questions on both the report specifically, but also generally your thoughts on the topic. And for those of you who are less familiar with Stronger Foundations, this is an opportunity for you to hopefully come away with a better sense of the work that we've been doing and where it's going. So I'm Emma, I'm the Policy and Communications Manager at ACF. I've been involved in Stronger Foundations since its inception, but specifically I've been quite heavily involved in leading on this work. So I'll be talking through the report today. I'm joined by Sally, who's my colleague at ACF, hiding behind the ACF logo. If you find yourself having any technical difficulties or issues with Zoom, please let Sally know and she'll do her best to help there. I'm also delighted to be joined by our two insightful speakers. So we have Paul Ramsbottom, who's Chief Executive of the Wolfson Foundation, and he has been the chair of the working group on transparency and engagement. So really interested to hear his reflections today on the theme and being involved in the process. We're also joined by Tanya Cohen, who's the Chief Executive at 360 Giving. And the 360 Giving is an initiative that a lot of you will be familiar with, but if not, 360 Giving helps organisations openly publish their grants data and helps people use it to improve charitable giving. So we'll be hearing from Paul, Tanya and myself a little bit more later. For now, just some quick housekeeping points. We're very grateful that you're spending an hour with us today, so we want to respect your time and we'll be finished by 12 o'clock. We are recording this session so that we can share it with our wider membership, so just so that you're aware that's happening. And one of the purposes of this webinar is to hear from you, so please do keep your questions coming. If you could post your questions in the chat box, I think that's the easiest way to do it. Keep them coming throughout as you have questions about what you're hearing, and then we'll have plenty of time at the end of this session to go through some of those questions. If there's anything that we don't get around to or that you don't hear today, I'll put my email address in the chat, so do get in touch later as well. So on the screen now you can see the agenda, how we'll run through. So I've already introduced our speakers, but we'd like you to introduce yourselves, so we'll do that in a minute. And I'll also give a bit of an introduction to Stronger Foundations so that we're all on the same page. After that, Paul will share his perspective, both on the theme and on the working group's inquiry. Then I'll be back to talk about the culmination of that work in the report. And finally, we'll hear from Tanya, who will offer her perspectives as CEO of 360 Giving. And then we'll have about 20 minutes at the end for questions. So as I say, do keep them coming in the chat box throughout. So as I said, in lieu of proper introductions, which we would do if this was a face-to-face event, we have a poll just to get a sense of who's in the virtual room. So Sally, can you bring that up, please? Great, thank you. So we just want to know a little bit more about you. So where are you joining the webinar from today? What size foundation are you? What kind of foundation you are, and whether you're a member of staff or a trustee. So I'll give you a few seconds, minutes just to fill in that poll. The responses coming in pretty quickly. I will be talking through the poll results because they won't show up on the recording, so it might be a bit obvious to you if you're looking at it, but it's for the recording's benefit. Okay, a few more people still left to vote, so we'll wait for those to come in. So it looks like we've got quite a mix so far. A few more people left to vote. I'll start talking through them. So where are you joining the webinar from today? We've got 86% of our participants are in England, but we have a few in Scotland, one in Wales, one in Northern Ireland, and two from outside the UK today. So welcome to our international audience. What size foundation are you? A real mixture here, almost half medium, but just as many small and just as many large, and one very large. So I think that will be a really interesting factor in thinking about transparency and engagement, because obviously we'll be thinking about kind of the different considerations related to the theme based on type of foundation. So also what type of foundation are you? This is interesting. Got a real mixture of family foundations, corporate foundations, library companies and independent foundations, a couple of fundraising foundations, some lottery distributors. So we've got every type of foundation with us. So that's really great. It'll be interesting to hear different perspectives when we get to the discussion. And then members of staff or trustees. So we've got 82% staff and 18% trustees. So welcome to everybody. It's really great to have people from both the staff team and the trustee team here. So we'll close the poll there. I just want to, before handing over to Paul, just say a few words about Stronger Foundations. Sorry, I'm just dealing with the poll. There's things on my screen that I can't get rid of. Sally, would you be able to bring up the Stronger Foundations overview slide, please? Because I think it's important just to spend a minute or two on Stronger Foundations so that we're all on the same page. I think people will have had different levels of involvement in it. So if you're not aware, this will hopefully take you through. So Stronger Foundations is ACF's flagship project that aims to help grant-making charitable foundations identify and pursue excellent practice. We launched in December 2017. We've been exploring 6 different themes, each one sort of having a related report. So you can see the themes listed on here. So for diversity, equity and inclusion, impact and learning, and strategy and governance, phase 1 of those groups has completed, and I'll talk a bit more about what comes next in a second. In the next couple of months, we'll be publishing reports on investing and on funding practices. And as the big yellow arrow shows today, we're talking about transparency and engagement. So we're about midway through publishing the different reports on the themes. They're all available on our website if you haven't seen them. So as I say, the first phase of this has been a discovery phase where 6 working groups comprising about 100 members have interrogated best practice in these areas. We've had evidence from about 50 external speakers from all sectors, from public, private, academic, charitable, and we've had the groups critically engaging with the issues and the evidence. From that, on each theme, ACF has collated pillars of stronger practice, and it'll be interesting to hear from Paul his reflections on being part of that working group. We're now moving on to the engagement phase of Stronger Foundations, where we're taking out these findings and the pillars to our members and to the wider foundation community and exploring how we can implement them in practice, and most importantly, well, not most importantly, but importantly, what support ACF can provide to help with that. So that's Stronger Foundations in a nutshell. If you do have any questions, do get in touch. We'll be happy to talk more about that, but hopefully that's kind of a broad overview. I'll now hand over to Paul Ramsbottom, who's chaired the working group on transparency engagement and is also chief executive of the Wolfson Foundation. So Paul, over to you.
Well, thank you very much, Emma, and it's a great pleasure to be invited to speak this morning. Before I do anything else, just want to pay tribute to the team at ACF, and perhaps in particular to you, Emma, as the prime author of this report. I think it's an excellent report, and I just wanted to say that the Stronger Foundations initiative seems, to my eyes at least, incredibly impressive and ambitious, and it's been great to be part of that. I also wanted to thank fellow members of the working group. I'm conscious I think quite a number have joined the webinar today. I found it a hugely enjoyable task, actually, to take time out from everyday working life to think through these really important issues. And actually, I think one of the enjoyable things about the working group is that we had neither responsibility for writing the report nor a need to come up with a set of consensual conclusions. But having said that, I do think it's true that there was a good degree of agreement around our discussions. And so, in speaking very briefly this morning, I'm not in any way going to attempt to summarize the report, but I will just try and pick up on 1 or 2 of the themes and conclusions that came out from our 7 meetings. But first, I think it'd probably be remiss of me not to mention the immediate context for the report. In recent years, there have been significant debates about transparency in all its varying shapes, definitions, forms, across public, commercial and charitable life in the UK. So that's the kind of wider context. But then, of course, in a very specific sense, philanthropy is under scrutiny as never before. If you need any evidence that sources of wealth power structures and philanthropy have become lightning rod topics in the UK and beyond, you don't need to look any further than the events of last week. Across the whole globe, one of the key media images of the last 7 days has been the statue of Bristol's most famous philanthropist being toppled and then dispatched at the bottom of the Avon River. So that, by way of context, I think in itself makes for a powerful argument for foundation transparency. Simply in terms of responding to the debates about transparency on the one hand, and debates around wealth and inequality and justice and philanthropy on the other. But I think it's fair to say, and I hope other members of the working group would agree with me, that our starting point, in a sense, was not a defensive one. Rather, it was a recognition of the benefits of transparency and the benefits of engagement to an effective foundation. Transparency, at least in my mind, is a great antidote to the key enemy of foundations, the enemy of complacency. Or as one of our guests, Pamela Doe, memorably said, no system was ever made worse by shining a light on it. So we had some fascinating discussions about the ways in which transparency can help to drive better practice. We discussed whether transparency was better as a voluntary or a mandated act. And in doing so, I guess inevitably, we got into the consideration of the various audiences to whom a foundation speaks, ranging from fellow funders to applicants to a wider audience of public and commentators. And those questions of transparency took us into the wider issues that the foundation sector face. That question of the nature of our audiences expanded out into questions of accountability and legitimacy, and indeed into the most fundamental questions of all. Why do we exist? And who do we exist for? But perhaps inevitably, a lot of the fruitful discussion lay around a working group of practitioners, all of us involved in foundations of different types, different scales, attempting to apply some of these grand principles to everyday working practices. And I think we were very mindful of not throwing out ideas and suggestions that could only be applied by very large foundations with decent sized administrative teams. And we did also spend considerable amount of time teasing out some of the complexity surrounding drives towards transparency. Indeed, the last session, when we had a wonderful guest speaker from America, was focused on when opaqueness can be something helpful rather than something malevolent. The group also continued to come back to the fact that while there is still much work to be done in the foundation sector on this issue of transparency, it does remain the case that we are the only part of the philanthropy ecosystem in the UK that is transparent. And so there is some paradox there that we attempted to, at least at some level, unpick. So, was it possible to draw out any conclusions beyond an intrinsic interest, importance, and complexity surrounding this whole subject? Well, I think my fellow members of the working group would agree with me that one key point of consensus was that in effective organizations, transparency, I think, is less a series of actions or processes and more of a mindset. That doesn't mean that every piece of data or decision making is inevitably public, but it does mean that an effective organization is thoughtful and intentional about what it doesn't publish and why it's not publishing, as well as what it is putting into the public domain. And crucially, genuine transparency, I think, also means more than simply broadcasting information. It's a mindset that makes engagement, that second word in the report title, that makes engagement with key external stakeholders completely central, listening, reacting, and adapting accordingly. So if we think of knowledge as power, then transparency with engagement are key tools in breaking down the traditional power dynamic between funder and recipient. So let me venture to end these kind of few brief thoughts on an upbeat, a positive note. A report that I often like to quote, which was written at exactly the time when the Wolfson Foundation, my own organisation, was set up 6 decades ago, commented that, and I'm quoting here, foundations are still, to the general eye, mysterious and remote organisations. Well, that may or may not still be the case, but it does seem to me that there is a clear direction of travel for foundations. And it's a direction of travel towards greater transparency. Transparency does require a degree of bravery and honesty in leadership. But increasingly, I think there is a recognition that traditional power structures do need to be subverted, and a recognition that transparency with engagement are key tools in that subversion. And so if that is indeed the direction of travel that many foundations are on, then it's my hope, and I'm sure the hope of the working group, that this excellent report will be a key milestone on that journey.
Thank you, Paul. I think you managed to cover a huge breadth of the topics that the working group considered there, and I hope that it's clear how that process of having the working group meetings and discussions really fed into the final report, and a lot of the issues that you brought up there about who should be involved, who the audiences are sort of considered within the report. So I'm just going to spend sort of less than 10 minutes now talking through the report itself, where we got to after this working group finished. Sally, could you bring up my slides, please? I want to give a flavour of what some of those working group meetings were. So Paul already touched on one that I'll mention. It's interesting that the 2 examples that I wanted to share with you are both from contributors based in the USA, and I think that really shows the kind of variation in practice and in thinking on these topics across different countries. And it'll be interesting to hear from our colleagues who joined us from Italy what the kind of current practice is there on transparency and engagement. So in meeting 2, the topic was, why should foundations be transparent? We heard from Janet Camarena, she leads the US-based initiative Glass Pockets. Some of you may be familiar with Glass Pockets. It rates foundations' transparency based on a series of indicators which ask whether different types and forms of information are available. Back in the very early days of Stronger Foundations, some might have considered this to be quite useful to have such a tool, the sort of rating system, but as Paul has illustrated, the thinking of the working group and of ACF really developed over the course of the inquiry, and having engaged with these indicators, it was felt that indicators and talking about what information is available don't necessarily offer the level of engagement that's required to be meaningful in transparency. And so, for example, information about decision making rather than just about process is often what is really useful and valuable, and that's really where engagement can come in. Paul also touched on this as well. In our final meeting, we heard from Bob Reed, who leads the US-based Maddox Foundation, and he's conducted significant research on the theme of transparency. Bob introduced this idea of strategic opacity to the group, so whereby decisions are made deliberately and intentionally in pursuit of the foundation's aims. So in many cases, leaning towards greater transparency will make the foundation more effective, there'll be better informed decision making, and many of the benefits that come with greater transparency and engagement. But there will be occasions where it's maybe more strategic and maybe more in the foundation's interests not to share certain pieces of information. So for example, if it enables the foundation to take a big risk that it otherwise wouldn't be able to. So this was a really good place to end the working group, we felt. as it nicely articulated a lot of that nuance and a lot of the complexities that the group have teased out throughout, and really hit home that transparency isn't this kind of absolute end state. It's about, it's a process of attitudes, of behaviours, of cultures, of changing, and it's not just about kind of putting out information. Sally, can I have the next slide, please? So Paul already touched a bit on kind of defining transparency, so I just kind of wanted to show you what we went with for the report, and it's very similar to what Paul was saying about it being a mindset. So we define it as an amalgamation of attitudes, actions, behaviours and cultures that result in usable and accessible information being available for a variety of purposes to a variety of stakeholders, including for holding foundations to account. And as Paul said, engagement is a really essential component to this. It's the engagement that means that the transparency isn't passive, but that it's proactive and that it's useful. So with no further ado, the actual pillars themselves. Sally, can you move on to the next slide, please? So I'll just run through these and say a few words on each one. I realise we're not giving you an awful lot of time to digest them, but hopefully some of these might resonate. So a stronger foundation understands the importance of transparency and engagement and articulates its approach. This goes back to sort of having an organisational understanding of that nuance, of the drivers for transparency, the complexities, and having a coherent approach to it that can be articulated. One thing we have included in this report that was a bit different is we kind of have a page setting out what some of the reasons why you might be transparent, and find that helps with foundation's effectiveness. So there are practical benefits about more informed decision making, its implications for accountability and legitimacy. So hopefully you find that useful. The second pillar is that a stronger foundation embeds transparency and engagement across all its activities. We felt this was really important to draw out because it's quite easy to think about funding practices in relation to transparency and about grantees and applicants as a main audience. But really, when we're talking about transparency and engagement, we're talking about investments, recruitment, operations, history. We've got a lot to think about within that. The third pillar is that a stronger foundation enables an internal culture of transparency and engagement. And this goes back to that relationship between the board and the staff, and it's great to have a mixture of staff and trustees here today. We've talked in previous reports about having a learning culture, and I think transparency is essential to that in sharing information and engaging with it and using it. The fourth pillar is that a foundation proactively engages its external audiences. This is important in avoiding becoming passively open, whereby the information is available but not usable. Throughout all of Stronger Foundations, we've been thinking about applying a lens of diversity, equity and inclusion, but this is a particularly important consideration when we're thinking about engaging external audiences. So who are they, on whose terms are you engaging, and so what's the foundation's reach? And then the final pillar is a strong foundation makes the most of opportunities and initiatives that enable transparency and engagement. So there are plenty of reasons why this is stronger practice. There are practical benefits to engaging with external opportunities, and as well as there being practical benefits, it kind of fosters solidarity within the sector and raises standards of practice across the board. So one such tool we might think of is 360 Giving, and we'll be hearing from Tanya shortly. But there are lots of others, including the opportunities that are provided from your ACF membership. So for example, sharing learning with other foundations through the magazine or through the networks. So that concludes a very quick run through of the pillars. I know you haven't had a huge amount of time to digest all that, but we're just going to take a quick poll to see whether there's any in particular that resonate with you. And I'll try and do better at doing the poll this time than last time, because I think I might have gone wrong there. So Sally, could you bring that up, please? Okay, so if you could just pick as many, we've got it on multiple choice, so as many as feel relevant. So whether you understand the importance of transparency engagement, embedding transparency engagement, enabling a culture, proactively engaging external audiences, and making the most of opportunities. So I've got some votes coming in. We'll give it a few more seconds to see if we get any more across. It's interesting they're actually growing at about the same level. I don't know if people are just ticking all of them. That's interesting, the kind of equal spread of it. So we'll keep the poll open for a little bit longer, just to see if any more votes come in. Seems to have maybe plateaued now, a couple more. Okay, I think we'll end the poll there. So apologies if you didn't get a chance to vote, but we want to have kind of plenty of time I think this is what I missed last time in sharing results. Hopefully you can all see that. So the first one seems to have won the most votes there, understanding the importance of transparency and engagement. I think if that's resonating, that's really interesting, that's kind of the base to the rest of the pillars. So that's a really good starting point to sort of be thinking about that one. But we've got pretty equal spread, with about half people saying all the other ones. So that's really interesting to see. So thank you for participating there. If you have any questions for me or for Paul, please do keep them coming in the chat. But now I will hand over to Tanya. Tanya Cohen is the CEO at 360 Giving. And Tanya, the floor is yours for the next 10 minutes.
Thank you. So as Emma mentioned, I'm the new Chief Executive of 360 Giving. I've only been in post a couple of months, but some of you will have met my predecessor, Rachel Rank, who contributed to the working group meetings. I really welcome the report, and I really value the transparency and engagement work. It's not only important to us individually and to our organisations, but also collectively as part of the ecosystem of the charitable sector. And as Paul said, it's really important to the trust and the relationships with stakeholders. I'm just going to do a very brief introduction to 360 Giving for those that don't know. I'm just going to share my screen now. We were founded 5 years ago by a philanthropist, Fran Perrin, who asked, how can I do as much as possible with my money? She wanted to know who was funding, what, where, and when. And others also had those questions and created and supported 360 Giving to support that. We support funders to publish grants data openly and to use that data as part of a more informed approach to decision making and learning. We're encouraging use and growing data literacy amongst funders. We've reached a critical mass over the last year, which means the data is more useful between funders and not just on its own. So over the last 5 years where we've become established, we now have 140 funders sharing over 30 billion of grants data. Our tools include GrantNav, which is a search engine for grants that brings 360 Giving data together, allowing near instantaneous search of over 380,000 grants. Users can explore and download the data, and because it's openly licensed, they can reuse it in their own tools and analysis for free. 360 Insights gives users tangible feedback on data, focusing on key pieces of information such as the type of organisations being funded, their location, age, their size. It basically brings together 360 Giving data with Charity Commission data and Companies House, and allows for lots of clever visualizations. And most recently, this is our COVID-19 grants tracker, which provides easy access to grant supporting organisations in response to the current crisis. So this is going to be further developed over the coming weeks to include more information and visualizations, for example, the size of the organisations funded and greater geographical mapping. But over 5,000 grants totaling over 75 million have been shared, and we know that there are a lot more coming in the pipeline. But as well as these tools and others, we run a number of programs and provide resources to support data use in organisations. We're not about transparency for transparency's sake, and I think that's important to recognise. Lots of funders share information individually, but we're supporting it to be more useful collectively and collaboratively. And so this echoes the feedback from Paul about it being a mindset and a culture. It isn't just about putting the data out there, but it's about how it's used and shared. It's been fantastic to see so much engagement with 360 Giving and the tools over the last couple of months since I've been in post, with over 4,000 people using the tracker alone. There's been a lot of progress, but it isn't a silver bullet in itself, and there's more to do. So on to the reflections on the report. I think it was great to see the collective initiatives and tools referenced in the report in Pillar 5. And of course, it was great to see 360 Giving highlighted. The one comment on the on that pillar and how it's been framed is that I would say that the initiatives and tools don't necessarily enable transparency and engagement, but when an organisation is transparent and committed to engagement, then the tools can help on that journey. There is a risk that the initiatives and tools themselves are seen as the full process, and publishing data to 360 Giving standard is not transparency engagement if it isn't embedded in the organisation and the processes. And I think my other reflection is about the importance of considering how activities cut across the pillars horizontally and not seeing the pillars as independent with different projects and activities in each. I think that's particularly the case for 360 Giving, but I think it will also apply to other activities. So for example, under Pillar 1, are you clear about why you're sharing data and who it's for? And this might impact what you share and how you do it. So as an example, I recently spoke to a funder who wasn't an existing publisher, who'd launched a small grants program. It's emergency funding round. They'd been completely inundated with applications. There were a lot more that they wanted to fund than was going to be possible. So they were able to see on the COVID grants tracker which organisations and groups had been funded recently by another funder, so that they could prioritise giving the funding to organisations that hadn't received anything and might be more vulnerable. So their priority was in publishing quickly and frequently to pay it forward, if you like, to other organisations that might be in a similar position. For other organisations, they might be distributing fundraised funds, and public accountability might be more important, which could be less about the speed and it could be more about the presentation and the descriptions and how you articulate what you share and how people would engage with it. So I think clarity on the reason and approach in Pillar 1 is important to those initiatives and tools that you might be using in Pillar 5. Similarly, under Pillar 2, how does the data fit with your other processes? Are you engaging organisations and collecting the data needed at the start through the application process? For example, we're finding that some funders are really keen to be transparent about their and share diversity information about their grants and grantees, but they haven't currently got the data recorded. Under Pillar 3, for us at 360 Giving, this is about making sure information is being shared, that's being shared externally for transparency purposes, is being shared internally first to inform that decision making, and also to make sure that it's fully understood. So what are the questions that you might be asked about the data, and do you have the answers? What are you learning yourselves from the transparency and engagement processes of sharing things externally? It's really important to understand why you're sharing, what it is you're sharing. And also going back to that point about if you're just putting things out there, if it isn't answering people's questions and if it isn't relevant to people and if it isn't useful, is that transparency or is that just putting stuff out there? And under Pillar 4, we really support the recommendation that organisations tell their story, but also recognise that genuine engagement is a two-way process. And as Paul said about the listening, it's not just about reaching your audiences, but being open to what comes back and being ready to discuss comments and answer questions in your engagement approaches. You'll get more out of the mechanisms if you put in more for people to contact you and give you feedback. And under Pillar 5, I think it's about choosing the right tools for your transparency engagement strategy that you've agreed in Pillar 1, and recognising that it's not a linear scale. It's not about the more initiatives you sign up to, the more transparent you are. It needs to be a fit to your organisation and the needs of your stakeholders. It might also be that you're more transparent in some areas than others. So I think, I've been using regulations from 360 Giving, but I think the principles hold true for all the tools and initiatives. For example, if you're signing up to Grant Advisor, think about how it might be embedded across each pillar and not just seen as something you're doing at the end as part of a Pillar 5 initiative. Genuine transparency and engagement requires an open to feedback and change. And it also requires appropriate resourcing. And appropriate doesn't necessarily mean lots of people or systems. It needs to be proportionate to the approach and the strategy. And it also doesn't all need to be additional resourcing. So some organisations that have invested in this area have found that it's shifted resources rather than adding to them. So for example, sharing more information and investing in digital engagement might reduce the number of less relevant applications received and reducing the capacity needed to assess and process them. Being open to feedback and amending processes as a result might increase efficiency. Skilling up people internally to do data analysis not only supports that external communications, but it can also support the more effective decision making and learning. I think these are things that 360 Giving can help with in terms of the data itself, but we've already seen that the impact that developing individuals can have on their organisations through our Champions programme. So overall, there's an understanding that there's a risk in building external communications capacity without the internal capacity to ensure the quality and understanding of what is being shared. So overall, I'd say there's been some great ideas in the report for transparency and engagement. And I would like to end on the point in the introduction of the report about intentionality. So making deliberate and intentional decisions about transparency and embedding those decisions across the processes and practices and using engagement and openness to feedback and to refine those will be really important to enhancing impact and effectiveness. So overall, I think it's a great report, and I'd encourage organisations to engage with it in different ways and are particularly looking at how they might apply things across the pillars and not just in individual pillars. Thank you.
Thank you, Tanya. That was really interesting. Thank you very much for that. I think you've echoed what I was about to say. Well, you said it already. The importance of being deliberate and intentional, and that's really at the heart of this report. That there are decisions to be made about what you do share and what you don't share, and I think you've given some really concrete examples of how it can be useful in sharing certain pieces of information, how they can be used. We'll move on to some questions now. So I've got a few lined up, which I will use my chair's privilege for later. We've got one here about what kinds of transparency we're talking about that go beyond what's already sort of required in the trustees report and the accounts. Sort of leaving aside the engagement for a second, Paul, I'll go to you first and give Tanya a minute to gather her thoughts if she'd like to comment on this question. But what can you talk a bit about what we've been thinking about beyond what goes in the annual accounts?
Yeah, I think it's an interesting question, Gareth. And one of the points of comparison when we spoke to Janet, who runs Glass Pockets in the US, is I think it did give a newfound appreciation for the UK regulator and the fact that there is a reasonable base level of information that has to go, as you say, in SORP and in the annual statutory accounts. I think we were thinking about the presentation of information in a much wider sense than that narrow financial sense. I mean, presenting in a way, whether through 360 Giving or in other senses, which is genuinely useful and accessible, but B, also teasing out beyond finances some of the wider information that audiences will find useful, how decision making takes place, for example, sharing perhaps something in terms of outcomes. So going sort of well beyond what is a sort of statutory responsibility where the primary audience is the regulator, potentially, to thinking about different types of audiences, how you put information in an accessible, friendly way, and how you tease out information beyond that. So I think that would be my response to Gareth's question.
Great, thank you. Tanya, I'm going to come to you with the next question, unless you had any thoughts to add to that one. With your working with funders, what do you see as the common barriers to increase transparency or to increase engagement? And importantly, how are these addressed?
I think some of that is around the intentionality that it mentioned. I think there's some organisations who are just not necessarily thinking about what it is that they want to be transparent about. And so I think that's the key barrier, is almost planning and thinking about it. I don't necessarily think that there are things where either people don't have the information, or that they are, it's not that they're uncomfortable with sharing the information, it's that they hadn't thought about the information being important to others, or that others might be interested in that. So I think that intentionality and about understanding your stakeholders is really important.
Paul, do you have anything to add on there? Any common barriers that you see towards increased transparency and how we address them?
I think it's a nervousness, and it's often a nervousness from the board. Actually, I noticed a comment from Paddy coming up in the list about trustees feeling a bit anxious. I mean, there is a sense that you are making yourself vulnerable by putting information out, and there is a sense that it's safer to retreat into the shadows. You're less likely, that theory goes, to face scrutiny if you stay out of the public spotlight. And so I think that probably in the foundation world is the primary barrier. I mean, I would argue that it actually is a kind of, it's a false argument in a way, that withholding information, particularly in this world that we're living in 2020, is not enough to avoid criticism. But actually, and this is where the report I think is so powerful, there are really strong and compelling reasons in a positive way to put information out.
Thank you for those answers. This next question kind of touches on something that we've all kind of mentioned, but talking about culture and going a bit further than just kind of using tools. Do you have any hands-on advice on how to help long-established trustees feel safe in the transparent world? And maybe elaborate a bit on that, talking about embedding that culture of transparency within an organisation. Paul, would you like to go first on this one?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really good question. And I mean, my sense, I'd be interested to know from others, my sense is that there probably is likely to be a little bit of a divide in some organisations between an executive team, whether that's one person or a wider team, and the board, where the executive team might see the advantages to a greater extent than the board. I mean, I think in terms of reassuring the board, it really is coming back to the same arguments about the benefits of putting information into the public realm, and actually in a way a kind of confidence of leadership that pushback from organisations and stakeholders that you work with isn't in itself a negative, and that feedback loop actually is in itself a positive, and perhaps to become just a little bit less sensitive as organisations, that actually constructive comment is in itself an important part of what we do and will help us to improve. And that a world where we release no information and receive no criticism or scrutiny is not a way to actually actively improve what we're doing. So I think those would be the arguments I would think of sort of marshalling.
Thank you. Tanya, do you have anything to add here?
Yeah, I think I would agree with that. And also recognising that the engagement might come first for some organisations, that they might be hearing things from stakeholders in terms of what their needs and expectations are before they might be sharing information. For others, it might be that they're sharing things and engaging people with it and getting the feedback then. I think there'll be different opportunities for different organisations to work out what is going to be right for them. And I think that's where it kind of goes back in terms of the pillars and developing those plans.
Great, thank you. Our next question is asking about being transparent about failures, which is interesting for anyone who's already read the report that we produced on impact and learning and the working group that led up to that. One of the pillars in there was about learning from failure, and we found that to be quite an interesting issue to discuss with different groups, because some foundations are quite comfortable talking about failure, others sort of prefer not to think of it as failure, and sort of thinking about the implications that it has to label something a failure and what that can mean for those involved in it. Would either of you like to come in on the issue of failure and being transparent about that? Paul,
Shall I dive in?
ready?
Shall I dive in first? I had a conversation earlier this week with an individual who was thinking of setting up their own foundation, and said, I'm planning to set it up as a DAF because I want to take a lot of risk with this and I want to fail, but I don't want to do that in the public arena, which was an interesting reflection. And I think one of the challenges for foundations in thinking about failure is partly the way in which you frame this. It seems to me that actually a mature organization that is experimenting in different areas and is finding that some things don't work has got a really important message to put out, and that actually that possibly is a more important, interesting and influential message than things which appear to be succeeding. But another complexity here, I think, is respect for the organizations that we work with as organizations. It's one thing to say that we as a foundation have experimented in this area and here's the learning, these are things that went well and these are things that went badly. It's another thing, I think, to cast a spotlight on an organization that you've worked with and to make an assessment of them and then to put that into the public domain. I think that's possibly where we come back to the issue of power dynamics. So I feel much more comfortable about putting failure when it's an honest reflection about initiatives undertaken by the organization. I feel less comfortable when it appears to be critical of third parties, particularly when they're not co-authoring whatever goes out into the public domain. So just a kind of few thoughts on that.
Well, accidentally or not, that's pretty much the pillar in the impact and learning report, talking about the failure of the foundation and not assigning blame, and sort of recognizing that the foundation is in a very different position to other partners that may have been involved in the same project or whatever it was, but the learning is really for the foundation. Tanya, would you like to come in on this one?
No, I agree with those points. I think but it also links to the engagement as well, in terms of communicating what you were trying to achieve, rather than necessarily just focusing on the outcome. So what you're trying to achieve and the learnings together might be that it's experimenting and you found something that you didn't necessarily know. I think just focusing just on the outcomes without putting it in the context of of the strategy can be a challenge.
Great, thank you. I've got a question here that, Tanya, I'll come to you first on it. So thinking about the current context with groups like Charity So White asking for organisations to publish data on their staff and trustee diversity, do you see that sort of being sort of wider attention turning towards that soon in this current context? Tanya, would you like to come in?
It is already things that we are being asked about and that organisations are looking at. I think it is going to be something which isn't just a one-off thing for now. I think it's an ongoing issue that organisations will need to look at their diversity. I think it's going to, and you've already seen in the reports that you've done in terms of the Stronger Foundations on the diversity area is and inclusion is going to be a much more important focus for some time to come.
And that might be an area where, going beyond the trustees' annual report, at the moment there isn't really much about that in there. So this might be an area that's kind of, that answers that question, goes beyond what transparency we're talking about. Paul, do you have any thoughts on this topic?
Just really to agree with Tanya, I think this is absolutely an issue that shouldn't go away and isn't going away. I think one of the interesting things, going back to transparency arguments, Charity So White reasonably have been calling out organisations who are saying one thing and appear to be doing another. And I think transparency will just help in that space. Transparency also, I think, does mean, going back to the questions about failure, being honestly reflective as an organisation, and perhaps making some or all of those reflections public. I think there is a fear when you're responsible for an organisation that you have to claim perfection in everything you do at all times. And I think it's a really interesting topic where strong leadership that is transparent says, actually, we haven't got this right at the moment. We're aware of that. We're putting in place steps to think about this, and here's what we're doing. And it seems to me that that is an effective and intelligent response, rather than either battening down their hatches or pretending that everything is fine.
And recognising that this is an opportunity because everyone's in the same position, that there is more that we could all be doing. So it's an opportunity at this moment in time to do that collectively, rather than it looking like there's just one organisation putting their head above the parapet. Everyone's going to need to do it in time.
Yeah, I think this is a really good example of how engagement goes with transparency so naturally, in that we're not just talking about publishing data, it's about, as you say, Paul, talking about what's happening surrounding that data, what efforts have been made for change. Got time for one more question, and it's about strategy. So we've talked a lot about kind of transparency in funding decisions and that sort of end of the process. But what about transparency in strategic direction and in planning strategy? Paul, would you like to come in first?
Yeah, and I think this is also where engagement comes in, absolutely. I mean, I tried to avoid talking too much about my own organisation, Wolfson Foundation, because in a sense I sat on the working group in a private capacity. But just to give you the example of what we've done over the last year in this sense. We undertook an engagement process with every organisation that we've been involved with over the last 3 years to feed in to a strategic framework, and then use that and the input from that to create a strategic framework, which then we've made public. And it does seem, I mean, it seems to me that a reasonably run organisation, whether a foundation or not, probably needs to be clear internally about what it wants to do and why it wants to do and how it's going to go about doing that. And that just the art of running an organisation is partly about making that public, so that all stakeholders internally and externally have a sense of where the organisation is going and why it's going there, and actually therefore how they may or may not fit into that. So it is, I think it's a good question, because it demonstrates both transparency on the one hand and engagement on the other.
Thank you. Tanya, would you like to offer some final comments?
I completely agree with that. I think that's really important.
Great, thank you. I won't ask another question, just so that we can all finish on time. So thank you very much for all your participation. There's been some great stuff in the chat that I've been trying to keep an eye on as well. So thank you very much for all of that. Before we finish, we just have a quick poll, just thinking about, now that we've started thinking about the topic and engaging with the report and the pillars, if there's anything that you'll be kind of taking away specifically. So Sally, could you bring up the poll, please, when you get a minute? Thank you. So are there any actions you might take to follow in today's webinar? So you could take these are kind of based on what we've seen with other reports, what's been useful. So you could take the report to your board, review your current practices in the context of the report, run a session with staff on the pillars, consider whether you could use any of the tools and platforms which facilitate greater transparency, or any other actions. So you can see you've got quite a few people still coming in voting. Give it a couple more seconds. If you haven't voted and you want to, please do. I'll end it in a few seconds. Okay, I think we'll end it there, and I'll remember to share the results. So, two most popular actions, review your current practices in the context of this report and consider whether you could use any of the tools and platforms which facilitate greater transparency. So it's really great that they're both very, very practical actions, and we look forward to hearing how you're all getting on with them. And Tanya might be looking forward to getting some calls off interested people in 360 Giving. Okay, I'll try and close that. So yes, we've just got 5 minutes left. So I'd just like to finish by thanking everybody. So thank you to Paul and to Tanya for your insights today. It's been really interesting. I hope everyone's found it as valuable as I have. Thank you to everyone who's attended. Thank you for giving up an hour to be with us, and we hope that this has sparked some thinking around transparency engagement, and we look forward to hearing your further reflections when you get a chance to read the report. And thanks to Sally for keeping us technologically on track, even where I've somehow managed to mess it up, so thank you. We will be sending out a survey just to see how you found the event and if there's anything that we could be doing better next time. We're all still getting used to webinars, so any feedback's appreciated. And yeah, I think I'll leave it there. So thank you very much. Enjoy the rest of your Fridays.